Okay, now in this first lesson of our dynamics section, we'll take some time to really just talk about a few important settings and some really important concepts and rules that you want to keep in mind whenever using dynamics in Maya. Okay, so to keep things relatively simple, I'm actually going to take a little bit of a detour from our central aircraft project that you've been working on for most of this course. And I'm really just going to show you in a very, very simple scene a few particle effects, and really more importantly, what I want to focus on in this lesson are some settings and some very, very important concepts that are going to be really, really critical as you start to work with dynamics in your own scenes. Okay, so let's start by just first applying some very, very simple particles to this sword. I'll go ahead and just make a very simple scene where we have sort of a fire on the blade of the sword. Now Maya actually has a few pre-built particle and dynamics effects. So to access these, let's first make sure that we are in the dynamics module. This is going to house a lot of the menus where we are going to start using a lot of our dynamics effects. For the beginning part of this lesson, we're just going to really focus on these effects. Now these effects are really just sort of what you could think of as templates. These are kind of a one-click solution for a lot of different particle behaviors. So let's start by just clicking on the surface that we actually want this fire to emit from. Let's go to Effects and Create Fire. Okay, doesn't really look like much has happened. The thing to keep in mind with dynamics is that they're very closely tied to your timeline. So dynamics usually refers to something that's going to happen during animation. So now, if I just simply come in and play back through my timeline, you can see that we do have some flames, or some at least particles that are coming off of this piece of geometry. Now at the moment, as I play this back, you can see it's not really behaving like fire. This is moving way, way too fast. This really doesn't have anything to do with the particles. It really has more to do with my animation settings. So if we click on this animation box right down in here, this will take us to the animation preferences. Specifically, what we need to look for is found inside this time slider. And we have this max playback speed. Right now we have this set to play every frame, which is fine, but at the moment the max playback speed is set to free, which means as fast as our graphics card can play this, or as fast as our system can play this, it's going to try to do that, which is why these particles just seem like they're moving pretty much at the speed of light. So let's go ahead and bump this down. Let's switch this to something like real-time 24 frames per second. So that way it should play these back now in a real time. There we go. That looks much better. Now, looking at these particles, these really don't look the way that you would expect in the viewport. This really doesn't look at all like you would expect to see from a flame. But the important thing to keep in mind is that the particle look, as far as the viewport goes, is really not at all an accurate representation of what you're going to see at render time. So when it comes to using dynamics, we have to focus and rely a little bit more on our renderer. So if I were to come in and render this out, you can see we're using right now Maya software to render this out, and here's our flames. Okay, so when it comes to working with particles, your renderer becomes a very, very important part of the equation. Now let's talk about some things to keep in mind and some rules that you're going to have to remember when it comes to working with particles in your timeline. The first thing that we want to make sure of is that when it comes to moving around within the timeline, we don't want to make it a habit of scrubbing the timeline whenever we have particles in a scene. So watch what happens. If I start, let's say at this frame 16, and start to scrub forward, everything seems okay. But now if I start to scrub backwards, my particles don't really behave the way that they should anymore. And if I start to continue to scrub, my particles just don't seem like they're acting quite right. And if I were to come through and actually start to jump through the timeline, my particles can completely explode. So the thing to keep in mind here is that when it comes to using particles, Maya, the way that it calculates particle positions is that it has to understand where the particles were at the frame previous before it can display where they are at the next frame. And same goes for the frame after that and the frame after that. When you start to interrupt that cycle by jumping around between frames, you can start to wind up with particles that completely explode. And if I were to come in and render this, you can see that reflects in the renderer as well. So anytime you work with particles, always make it a habit to jump all the way back to the very beginning of your timeline. So click all the way back. You can see my particles disappear. And now when I play, everything looks fine. And really the thing that you have to remember is that when it comes to seeing the effects of your particles are not going to update if your timeline isn't moving. So if I were to grab, let's say, a part of this sword, grab this little grip down here, this handle, press the up arrow key on my keyboard to grab this whole group, switch to my move tool, and I'll pull this sword over. You'll notice that these particles don't follow the sword, and that's completely normal. Again, these particles will never update as long as the timeline isn't moving. And you can see this, again, if I were to come in and render that, you can see my particles remain at their original position. However, as soon as I start to play this back again, the particles will update with their new and proper position. So always keep in mind that as you are starting to work with your particles, don't trust necessarily what you see in the viewport. As you're starting to play with these particles and adjust their settings, try to rely more on the animation. So as you start to adjust these particles, make sure that you're playing them back so that you can actually see their effect. And then also make sure that you start to rely a little bit more heavily on the render view, because again, that's going to be a much more accurate representation of what you're actually going to get compared to what you have here in the viewport. Now, when it comes to removing your particles, this can be done in a couple of different ways. The method that I find is easiest is to jump into something like your outliner. So the outliner is the same area where Delano was showing us some of the rigging stuff in Maya whenever we start to set up our controls. This is also where we can start to find things like our particles. You can see whenever we use these pre-built effects that Maya also starts to add in things like gravity, air resistance, and things like that. So to remove these particles, it's just as simple as selecting them in the outliner and deleting those out of my scene. And what we should see now is once we play this through, we have no more particles. Okay, so that's a look at just some of the basic things that you'll really need to keep in mind as you start to work with particles and other dynamics effects in your scene, making sure that we rely on the timeline, relying on the render, and making sure that we don't ever get in the habit of scrubbing back and forth between our timeline to see our particles, because that will completely destroy our particle behavior. So now that we have these really basic concepts under our belt, in our next lesson we'll jump back to the aircraft project and start to take a more in-depth look at the process of setting up and controlling particle dynamics.